This video will cover how to set the main and countershaft preload. It is a visual reference only. Access the current service information for the complete procedure. Install the synchronizer fixture and snug the fasteners anchoring it to the transmission case. Set the synchronizers to the positions specified in the repair instructions located in impact. Measure the main shaft master shim and enter this value in row A of the shim calculation worksheet. Repeat this procedure for the countershaft main shim. Ensure that the main shaft and countershaft bearing races protrude slightly beyond the rear surface of the transmission case to allow the shims to seat the races to their installed depth. Install the countershaft and main shaft master shims. Install the bearing retainers and torque to specification using the old fasteners. Install the setting tool into the countershaft. Check that the tool is fully seated in the shaft and snug without over-tightening. Install the adapter and setting tool on the main shaft and snug as an assembly. Install the brace extensions in the recesses of the bearing retainer cover. Install the brace and the nut, leaving the nut loose. Use a dead blow hammer to tap firmly on each threaded tool to seat the shafts. Rotate the shafts while tapping them. Install the magnetic stand and dial indicator so that the stem is as perpendicular to the shaft face as possible. Zero the dial indicator. Tighten only enough to remove the tooling slack, which may affect the readings. Loosen the nut. Firmly tap the threaded tool to reseat the main shaft and repeat the measuring procedure with the dial indicator and note the measurement. Repeat the process until a consistent measurement is achieved and take the average. Enter this measurement in row B of the preload worksheet. Calculate the shim thickness required for the countershaft preload. Add rows A and B to calculate the shim thickness at neutral preload. Next, add the value of A plus B to the preload specification in row X. This figure, A plus B plus X, indicates the thickness of the finally installed shim for the correct main shaft preload. Remove the dial indicator, magnetic stand, and brace. Install the brace on the countershaft and leave the nut loose. The extensions are not required for the countershaft. Firmly tap the threaded tool in the countershaft while rotating the shafts to reset the countershaft. Install the magnetic stand and dial indicator such the stem is perpendicular to the face of the threaded tool in the countershaft. Tighten the nut only enough to remove any tooling slack that may impact the measurement. Zero the dial indicator. Tighten the nut on the countershaft until the shaft begins to turn and stop immediately. Record the measurement on a scratch pad. Loosen the nut, firmly tap the threaded tool to reset the countershaft and repeat the measuring procedure with the dial indicator and note the measurement. Repeat the process until a consistent measurement is achieved and take the average. Enter this measurement in row B of the preload worksheet. Remove the nut, brace, and threaded tool from the countershaft. Then remove the threaded tool and adapter from the main shaft. Calculate the shim thickness required for the countershaft preload. Adds row A and B to calculate the shim thickness at neutral preload. Next, add the value of A plus B to the preload specification in row X. This figure, A plus B plus X, indicates the thickness of the finally installed shim. Remove the fasteners from the countershaft bearing retainer and discard them. Remove the bearing retainer and master shim. Repeat for the main shaft shim. Procure and measure the correct thickness main shaft preload shim for final installation. A table of shim thickness and corresponding part numbers can be found in Impact Parts, Function Group 43. Measure each shim before installation to ensure that it meets the specified thickness required. Clean the bearing race surface and the shim with a clean shop rag. Remove any debris or oil residue. Install the shim on the main shaft bearing race. Replace the O-ring on the oil tube. Lubricate the O-ring with petroleum jelly and insert the oil tube into the main shaft bearing retainer. Install the bearing retainer and oil tube as an assembly, using caution not to damage the line. Ensure that the bearing retainer is seated properly. Procure and measure the correct thickness main shaft preload shim for final installation. Measure each shim before installation to ensure that it meets the specified thickness required. Clean the bearing race surface and the shim with a clean shop rag. Remove any debris or oil residue. Install the shim on the countershaft bearing race. Install the countershaft bearing retainer. Install new bolts in both the main shaft and countershaft bearing retainers, torquing the fasteners to specification.